Hi everyone, welcome to Mountain Home Stories. Today is going to be a different genre, a Gothic horror genre, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is a Gothic horror novella written by the Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson. It follows Gabriel John Utterson, a London-based legal practitioner who investigates a series of strange occurrences between his old friend Dr. Henry Jekyll and a murderous criminal named Edward Hyde. So before starting with the story, a gentle reminder, if you are new to my channel, please do consider subscribing to it. And now, without wasting any further time, let's just start off with this story. Read along with me. Meet Mr. Utterson. Mr. Utterson was a lawyer. He was a rough-looking man. No smile ever crossed his harsh face. It was almost as if his nature showed up on his face. He spoke very little, and when he did talk, his voice was cold. It was almost as if he was embarrassed to speak. He didn't show too many kind feelings either. Tall, slender, and boring, he was still fairly likable. The pleasant side showed up when he met people he knew and had sipped a little wine. Although he would not say it, his eyes gleamed. Strict with himself, he drank only wine in company. Gin, a stronger drink, was fit to be drunk only when he was alone. He enjoyed watching plays, but had not seen on in 20 years. Rather than criticize people who did wrong, he could tolerate them and even wished he could have the courage to do what they had. His face never showed any dislike when they came to meet him. This was not too difficult for Mr. Utterson, since his face seldom showed any emotion anyway. He was a modest man who accepted his friends for what they were. He was friendly with people, not because they were suitable for him, but because he had known them for a long time. One such person was Mr. Richard Enfield, who was distantly related to him and was also known in town. They were as different from each other as chalk and cheese, and people wondered how they were friends enough to go on walks of a Sunday, even though they did not say much to each other and were always happy to meet a third friend. To both men, this walk was the high point of the week. On one such day, they walked down a quiet and prosperous lane in a busy part of London. The shutters had been recently painted, and the brass fitting on doors had been polished. The neighborhood was clean and cheerful. To the left, 2 houses from the corner, there was a small patch. Near it, right on the street, was a house that looked threatening. Double-storied, the entire front had just a door. Above it was a wall that had faded with neglect. The door had no bell or knocker. The paint was peeling. Homeless people sat outside. Children played on the steps. The plaster had been scarred by boys who sharpened their knives on it. For almost a generation, no one inside the house seemed to mind. The story of the door. The 2 friends were walking by on the other side of the lane. As they crossed the door, Mr. Enfield pointed with his cane. He told Mr. Utterson that he believed there was a very strange story he had heard about the house. He was returning home at about 3 in the morning on a winter night down a deserted street. Everyone was asleep. The empty streets were lit as if for a happy occasion. Mr. Enfield hoped he would see at least a policeman. That is when he saw 2 people. A short man walking briskly and a girl about 8 or 10 years old running. They bumped into each other at the corner of 2 streets. The child fell and the man walked over her. The child screamed in pain. The man walked on as if he had not heard. Mr. Enfield called out to the man, chased him, caught him by the collar and brought him back to where the child was still screaming, surrounded by several people who turned out to be her family. The man did not resist Mr. Enfield and looked at him. He was so ugly that it made Mr. Enfield break out in a cold sweat. The child had been going to fetch a doctor. The doctor also showed up. The child was more afraid than hurt. Mr. Enfield and the child's family recoiled when they looked at the man who had hurt the child, but the doctor did not react. The doctor, of indeterminate age, seemed to be from Edinburgh from the way he spoke. He showed no emotion. Mr. Enfield and the doctor told the man that they would make the incident public and shame him. The women in the group obviously hated the man in the center, who was frightened but still calm. He told Mr. Enfield that he wished to avoid a scene and offered to pay to buy their silence. They made sure he gave £100 for the child. Since he was not carrying so much money, he took them to the same faded door, opened it with a key and went in, keeping the crowd waiting outside, and came back. He handed over £10 in gold and a cheque for the rest. There was a name on the cheque, but Mr. Enfield was not going to mention that. It was known, often written about. So Mr. Enfield believed the man had committed a fraud when he wrote out a cheque in the famous person's name. The man promised to stay with them till the bank opened and cash the cheque himself to prove himself genuine. So the doctor, the girl's father, and the man went to Mr. Enfield's room to spend the night out. When the bank opened, Mr. Enfield handed the cheque over the counter and found it was genuine. It was truly the signature and account of a man famous for his principles, a person known to do good. The man in front of them, on the other hand, looked truly an evil man. Since he had to pay to buy their silence, it was almost blackmail. So Mr. Enfield called the place Blackmail House. Who lived there? Mr. Utterson asked him suddenly if he knew whether or not the person who wrote the cheque lived behind that door. Mr. Enfield said that, as far as he had noticed, that famous and respected gentleman lived somewhere else. Instead of asking any question, he named the lane Queer Street. He had been keeping a watch on the door and had noticed that there was no other door to that house, and no one left or entered by the door that the man had gone in from. There were 3 windows on the first floor, but there were no windows on the ground floor. The windows never opened. Yet, strangely, they were clean. Another proof that the house was lived in was the smoke that seemed to come out from the chimney of that house. Yet, it could also be from the chimney of a neighbouring house. Mr. Utterson asked Mr. Enfield the name of the person who had walked over the child. Mr. Enfield said it was Mr. Hyde. He found it difficult to describe him. There was something despicable about his face, although one could not say what it was. Mr. Utterson was lost in thought. Then he asked if Mr. Enfield was sure the man had used a key. The question surprised Mr. Enfield. He almost jumped out of his skin to hear something so strange. Mr. Utterson told him that he understood it was a strange question, but it was based on something else. He had not asked for the other person to be named. It was because he knew it already. He gave Mr. Enfield a chance to go over the story and correct anything that he believed he may have said incorrectly. Mr. Enfield was not happy to hear that. The effect of his story had been partially lost. He told his companion that he ought to have warned him that he also knew certain facts. As far as the veracity of the details he had given, he assured him that he had been precise. He was sure the man had used a key to enter the house. He was sure the man still had the key, since he had seen him use it less than a week before. Mr. Utterson let out a long sigh. He fell silent. The younger Mr. Enfield began to speak again. He said this had taught him not to confide in anyone. He offered Mr. Utterson a deal. Neither of them would ever speak of this incident ever again. Mr. Utterson agreed. The 2 men shook hands on that. Search for Mr. Hyde. In the evening, Mr. Utterson returned to his house, where he lived alone because he had not married, looking grave and deep in thought. He had his dinner without enjoying it or paying much heed to what he was eating. Every Sunday after dinner, he would sit by the fire. There would be a book of religious discourse on his desk that he would go through. At the stroke of midnight, announced by the church in the neighborhood, he would say a prayer of thanks and go to sleep. This particular night, he picked up a lighted candle and went into his office. He opened the safe and from its depth, he took out paper. On the envelope that held the document were 3 words: Dr. Jekyll's will. Mr. Utterson sat at the desk. He decided to read it. His face broke into a worried look. Mr. Utterson had taken charge of the will only after it was ready. He had not helped with the making of the will. When he opened the will, he read that in the case of the death of Dr. Henry Jekyll, MD, DCL, LLD, FRS, etc., all his material things were to be given to his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde. If, however, Dr. Jekyll disappeared or was absent without a known cause for more than 3 months, Edward Hyde would get everything right away. He would clear the outstanding dues to the employees of Dr. Jekyll and keep the rest. Mr. Utterson had not liked this will. As a lawyer, he did not like it, and since he was a sensible person who kept to an almost predictable routine, he did not like it either because he had imagined certain things about Mr. Hyde. Now he was sure after reading the will. For a long while, he had been upset because the name was just a name. He could not find out more about the person. It was now worse when he began to learn that the person had despicable habits. He was now sure the person was a brute and an evil man. For a long while, indeed, till he had opened and read this will, he had believed that his dislike for this particular will was because of his own irrational thoughts. But after he put the strange and loathsome will back into the locker, he knew it was a disgraceful document. Mr. Utterson blew out the candle and put on a thick and long coat. He left the house and made his way towards Cavendish Square, which was the hub of doctors. His friend, the famous Mr. Lanyon, lived there and also saw his patients in the crowded chamber. He believed that if anyone could throw more light on the issue, it would be Dr. Lanyon. At the house. When he reached the house, he was met and welcomed by Dr. Lanyon's solemn butler. Since the butler knew this particular visitor, he did not keep him waiting. Mr. Utterson was taken right away, with no delay, directly to the dining room. He found Dr. Lanyon sitting there alone with a glass of wine. Dr. Lanyon was a cheerful, healthy, smart man with a reddish flush to his face. His mop of hair had been white for as long as Mr. Utterson could recall. He was, by nature, energetic and determined. The moment he saw Mr. Utterson, he jumped up from the chair to welcome him warmly. Anyone who did not know Dr. Lanyon may have believed he was putting on a show of being friendly, but it was sincere joy at meeting an old friend. Mr. Utterson and Dr. Lanyon had gone to the same school and college. Both had a healthy respect for one another. They also enjoyed spending time with each other. Mr. Utterson began by making small talk. Then he went directly to the point of what had disturbed his mind. He told Dr. Lanyon that he and Mr. Utterson were two of Henry Jekyll's oldest friends. Dr. Lanyon did not seem to see what it was leading to, since he joked about their age. He also added that he had hardly seen Dr. Jekyll in recent times. At one time, the two doctors had shared some common interests, but for over the past 10 years, Dr. Jekyll had changed and Dr. Lanyon could not accept that. He believed that Dr. Jekyll was going wrong in the way he had begun to think. He had begun saying things that were unscientific. Just the thought of Dr. Jekyll made the cheerful doctor lose his temper for a moment. Mr. Utterson was reassured to see the reaction in his friend. He told himself that the two doctors had fallen apart because of some scientific premise that they differed on. The only aid the lawyer took from science and technology was modern conveyance. He waited for a few moments for the doctor to forget his anger and revert to his pleasant nature. Then he asked him the exact question he had come to find an answer to. Had Dr. Lanyon ever met Mr. Hyde, whom Dr. Jekyll seemed to guide and help? Mr. Lanyon repeated the name as he took time to think. He was sure he had never heard of such a person. That was all the information that Mr. Utterson got from the doctor. He went back home to the large bed made of dark wood. He tossed around in bed and could not sleep almost all through the night, his mind troubled by questions to which he had almost no answers. His mind seemed as dark as the night outside. A new day dawns. At 6 the next morning, the bells from the church near Mr. Utterson's house rang. He had still not caught a snatch of sleep, nor had he come any closer to finding any answers to the questions troubling his mind. At first it was just facts that he was trying to piece together. Soon, in the absence of factual answers, his imagination began to run away with him. His mind went over the sequence of events related by Mr. Enfield several times till he could almost see the events for himself, as if he were a witness to the empty streets of that night. The rows of street lamps the child running at the crossing and bumping into a man walking briskly, the child falling from the impact, and the man walking over the screaming child, oblivious of her pain and fear. At other times, he could see a room in the house of a rich family with his friend asleep and dreaming. The door of the bedroom would open, the bed curtains would be parted by the person coming in, and there would be standing a man whom he had to heed. The two visions played in his mind over and over again all night. If he dozed, the scene would play before his sleep-laden eyes all over again till he felt dizzy. But he could not see the face of the person who had crushed the child. That made the lawyer more determined to see the face of Mr. Hyde. He knew that if he could see Mr. Hyde, some of the mystery behind that will and that accident on the road would explain themselves and not seem mysterious at all. It would also explain the part of the will that read so strangely. If nothing else, he would get to see the face of an unusual man who had absolutely no mercy even for a child, a face that Enfield would hate for long. A mystery that must be solved. From that day, Mr. Utterson went past the mysterious door as often as he could. He would check it out on his way to the office, and again at noon when the neighboring shops were buzzing with customers, and then again at night when the moon cast a hazy glow on the street. He was determined to spot Mr. Hyde. One pleasant, frosty night, his patience bore fruit. The street was empty and clean, the lamps were shining. Around 10 o'clock, the shops downed their shutters. The sound of traffic rumbling came from a distance, but the immediate neighborhood was silent. Mr. Utterson had been standing and watching the door for some minutes when he heard strange footsteps coming towards him. The steps came close, rather fast. As the person came to the head of the street and turned into the lane, the steps became much louder. Mr. Utterson looked out from where he stood and he could see a small man. He was dressed simply. Although he was still some distance away, something seemed wrong with the person that Mr. Utterson did not like at all. The person went directly to the strange door and had to cross the road. As he neared the door, he took a key out from his pocket. Mr. Utterson came out from where he was observing the man. He tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Mr. Hyde, I think." The startled man drew back with a sharp draw of breath that almost sounded like a hiss. But he soon got his confidence back. He did not look directly at Mr. Utterson, but he admitted that he was Mr. Hyde. He asked Mr. Utterson what he wanted. Mr. Utterson remarked that he was an old friend of Dr. Jekyll and in fact believed that Mr. Hyde may have heard Dr. Jekyll mention him. Since Mr. Hyde was entering his home, he hoped he would invite Mr. Utterson in. Mr. Hyde tried to discourage Mr. Utterson. He told him that he would not find Dr. Jekyll at home since he was out. He asked Mr. Utterson how he knew him. Mr. Utterson did not answer that directly. Instead, he asked Mr. Hyde to show him his face. Mr. Hyde hesitated for a while and then looked at Mr. Utterson defiantly. The two men looked at each other. Mr. Utterson told him that he would recognize him if they met again. Mr. Hyde said it was good that they had met and he gave him his address. It was of a house in Soho. Mr. Utterson wondered if Mr. Hyde had also been thinking of the will, but he did not say anything about it to Mr. Hyde. He asked Mr. Utterson how he had placed him. All Mr. Utterson told him was that he had heard his description from common friends. Mr. Hyde seemed surprised that they had common friends and asked who Mr. Utterson was referring to. His voice suddenly sounded a little hoarse. One of the friends Mr. Utterson named was Jekyll. Mr. Hyde burst out in anger that Dr. Jekyll could not have mentioned him and he had not thought that Mr. Utterson would have told a lie. Mr. Hyde gave a strange, savage laugh and suddenly, in a swift moment, he unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. Mr. Utterson stood outside for a while, rather disturbed. He turned and walked slowly up the street. After every few steps, he would stop to think. Would they ever know? Mr. Utterson was perplexed. The problem that he was trying to solve was most likely to remain a mystery. Mr. Hyde was small and pasty. He seemed a little deformed, although it was not apparent what his deformity was. There was something unpleasant about his smile, and although he had seemed timid at first, he had also been bold and swift in his escape. His voice was not pleasant either. None of these should have made Mr. Utterson dislike him, and yet he found himself overtaken by a strange fear and disgust. So, what was it? There was something less than human about Mr. Hyde. He reminded him of the troglodyte who lived underground or in caves. Or perhaps it was the sheer evil in him that could not be contained. To Mr. Utterson, Mr. Hyde's face had the signature of the devil. As he came out of the lane and turned the corner, Mr. Utterson came across a square of old and elegant houses. Most had seen better times and had now been converted into flats so that they could be rented out to several people to recover some money. In them lived people of different professions, from architects and lawyers of dubious repute to agents. The second house from the corner was still holding its own and had not been rented out. Its door spoke of wealth. Mr. Utterson stopped there and knocked. He was answered by an elderly employee. Mr. Utterson, who knew the man, addressed him as Poole and asked him if Dr. Jekyll was at home. Mr. Poole led Mr. Utterson into a large hall lined with oak cabinets. He said he would see if the doctor was in. As Mr. Utterson waited by the fireplace, he admired the beautiful hall that was the favorite of Dr. Jekyll's and was arguably one of the most comfortable rooms in the city. Even a room as pleasant as the hall could not help Mr. Utterson forget the unpleasant face of Hyde. Mr. Utterson did not often dislike people, but that night he felt his blood turn cold. He began to imagine a warning from the patterns the light from the flames made on the cabinets. Poole entered to tell him that Dr. Jekyll was not in. Mr. Utterson told Poole he had seen Mr. Hyde open the old dissection room. Mr. Utterson knew all this time that the house with the strange door that had intrigued his friend since that fateful night was actually the laboratory and the rare entrance to Dr. Jekyll's house. It was convenient for Dr. Jekyll. The servant confirmed that Mr. Hyde had a key to the door. Mr. Utterson pointed out that Dr. Jekyll seemed to have a lot of faith in the younger Mr. Hyde. Poole told him that the staff had been ordered to do as Mr. Hyde asked them to. Mr. Utterson wondered if he had ever met Mr. Hyde at Dr. Jekyll's. The butler informed him that Mr. Hyde never dined at Dr. Jekyll's home. Mr. Poole informed him that Mr. Hyde spent most of his time in the laboratory. A worried friend. Saddened and worried for his friend Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Utterson wished good night and stepped out. He felt sorry for his friend Dr. Jekyll because he feared that he was in trouble. Mr. Hyde probably had got to know some indiscretions of his youth and was blackmailing him. As they said, no one ever got away by doing something wrong. Long after events are buried in the backyards of one's memory, justice is done, even if it comes slowly. The very thought scared Mr. Utterson. He thought for a while about his past, wondering if some wrongdoing was lying in wait for him. But Mr. Utterson had little to worry about. His past had been rather flawless. He had done little that he could be blamed for. Few people could have been as scrupulous and untarnished as he had. Yet, since no one is perfect, he was troubled by some mistake he had made. He also felt happy that he had come close to making some mistakes but had drawn himself back at the right time. Then one thought consoled him. Mr. Hyde himself must have secrets. From his face, it seemed that he had very dark, terrible secrets that must be much worse than whatever it was that Dr. Jekyll had done. If Mr. Hyde was indeed threatening Dr. Jekyll, how sad it was for the doctor. This could not go on. If Mr. Hyde got to know about the will that Dr. Jekyll had given Mr. Utterson, he would claim his dues. If only Dr. Jekyll would let him help him. Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease. A fortnight passed. At the end of it, Mr. Utterson was invited to the house of his old friend, Dr. Jekyll. It was indeed a matter of good luck to be invited to one of the generous and fine diners that Dr. Jekyll was known to throw. The guest list included about 5 or 6 of his old friends. They were all intelligent, well-read people. They held positions of good standing in society. All of them were connoisseurs of good wine. Mr. Utterson could not let such an opportunity pass by him. He planned it in such a way that he was the last to leave. There was nothing unusual about this, really, since he had stayed back after the other guests had left many times before. Not everyone liked Utterson, but those who did found him extremely likable. Although he was not charming company or a glib talker like many of the other guests, he was the favorite of most of his hosts. After an evening of mirth and merriment, they found it interesting to talk to him. This guest was modest, and he brought calm back to them. It was soothing to end the evening with him, since too much merriment could be strenuous. Dr. Jekyll was certainly one among the hosts who often held Mr. Utterson back for the pleasure of his solitary company. They sat away from the fire. Dr. Jekyll was a large man of about 50 years. There was a hint of slyness about him, but it was overpowered by his kindness. It was apparent that he was very fond of Mr. Utterson. What will Mr. Utterson say? Mr. Utterson told him that he had been waiting to have a word with him. The matter he wanted to discuss was the will that Dr. Jekyll had given him for safekeeping. If someone had been observing Dr. Jekyll closely, he may have detected a change in the doctor's face that indicated that he found the issue of the will unpleasant. But his cheerful voice did not echo the shadow that passed over his face. He said he pitied Mr. Utterson for being almost as distressed with the will as was Lanyon with Dr. Jekyll's scientific studies and beliefs. This, of course, Dr. Jekyll assured Mr. Utterson did not make him judge Dr. Lanyon, who, in spite of his misgivings about Dr. Jekyll, was a wonderful person whom he wished he could meet more often. However, Dr. Jekyll believed Dr. Lanyon was ignorant and believed what had been taught to him. He did not question things, nor did he have much independent thought, and had thus disappointed Dr. Jekyll. Utterson chased his earlier thoughts almost as relentlessly as if he had not heard this new discussion that Dr. Jekyll wished to start about their common friend, Dr. Lanyon. He told Dr. Jekyll that he had never approved of the will. Drawn back to the discussion of the will, Dr. Jekyll admitted that he knew of Utterson's disapproval, and in fact, his friend had told him so himself. Dr. Jekyll did sound a little irritated to be discussing the will. Although he could sense his host's discomfiture, the lawyer continued the subject. Mr. Utterson said he would repeat what he had said earlier. He added he had learned something about young Mr. Hyde. At this, the handsome, florid face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale. His eyes grew dark, as if in rage or in alarm, or a bit of both. He said he did not wish to hear any more on the subject. He reminded Mr. Utterson that it was a topic that they had agreed never to discuss. Mr. Utterson continued to talk. He insisted that what he had heard about Mr. Hyde was terrible. We'll continue with the next part of the story in another video. Hope you enjoyed reading the story with me. Leave me a comment and let me know. Please do like and share, and of course subscribe to my channel if you're new to it. Hit on the notification bell for my next videos, and thank you so much for dropping by. Come back to hear me again. Till then, take care and bye-bye.